In this video, we're going to do a little bit of a design critique of some of the most famous maps you might have ever seen. We're going to start with one of the maps that we see every 4 years now, without fail, the election map, where we show red states versus blue states. And this emerged in the early 90s, I think. I think was the first time this kind of became a thing. But we see this map, and we're drawn to the idea here that there are two kinds of states, red and blue. Now, we use color for meaning. And so by giving us a state map that looks like this, what do we imply? We imply that Texas, Montana, South Carolina, and Florida are, for all intents and purposes, exactly the same. And that the Northeast, Oregon, and California, for instance, are exactly the same. Red states are all red, blue states are all blue. Now, we know that that's not really the case. We know that, in fact, much of California leans Republican, and parts of Texas are heavily Democrat. So a map like this can create confusion, all right? So let's take a look at an alternative here, where we actually show the same map, but instead we show it by county, where we have red counties and blue counties. And we see that as far as area goes, there's a lot more red area, but we know that the population centers are heavily blue. And it really gives you a different viewpoint. We consider Minnesota generally to be a very liberal state, but really only the Twin Cities and the upper part of Minnesota, which is called the Iron Range, are heavily Democrat. We consider South Carolina to be relatively consistently Republican, but we see that there's actually a large swath of South Carolina that is rather Democrat, at least in this particular election. Again, though, we're only using two colors in this map. We're using red and blue. And so we are assuming that, again, all the red counties are alike, all the blue counties are alike, and that's not really the case. And so here is a diverging gradient map that might show this a little bit better. We're still at the county level, but now where a county is heavily Democrat, it's dark blue, and where it's barely Democrat, it's light blue, and the same thing with Republican. It is heavily red where it is leans heavily Republican, and light red elsewhere. And we see that this tells a very different story than the original map does. In the original map, we talk about red states and blue states. In many cases, there aren't even red counties. Most of the counties in the country are some sort of, light blue or light red. And so maybe we aren't as different as we think. Maybe we aren't as polarized as we are led to believe from the original map, all right? So pay attention to the use of color in all of the visualizations you do and what color is implying, especially in maps. Let's look at another example. Here is the same data by population density. So we see now that it illustrates better that although, remember, in the original graph, far more of the country was red, well, that makes sense because there's fewer people out there. And so where the blue is just concentrated, there's a far more people. And this map is trying to illustrate that there are some population centers, like in this case, Dallas-Fort Worth, in Texas, or over in Arizona that are heavily Republican. There are also population centers like New York and San Francisco and Los Angeles that are highly, highly Democrat. This is a 3D version that we will just ignore and reject out of hand. Here's a different example, which is not the election map, but this is another one of those graphs that broke the internet the day it was published. This was on Reddit, right? And this is saying the United States economic activity split in half. Again, we're using two colors, so we're implying that all of the area of the United States that's blue is exactly the same, and all of the orange is exactly the same, and the orange is all very different from the blue. We're assuming that the blue area is more different than the orange, then is any part of the orange different from itself? And that may or may not be true. For those of you who know your geography, what are we mapping here? The orange is where? It's in the heavy population centers. And that kind of makes sense, that where half the people live, maybe there's half of the economic activity, right? And maybe that's really what we're mapping. Are we mapping economic activity, or are we just mapping population? Now, they should correlate, that makes sense, but what are we mapping, right? And this did break the internet, and they kind of illustrated the fact that you could pretty much use this gradient map of population to illustrate any particular phenomenon. But the key thing that I love that came from the discussion of this map, because it broke the internet and people were arguing, is this a good map or a bad map? I love this critique here, because what's implied by the map from the index of economic activity, if you look on the left side, the orange half of the country is way up at the top, the blue half is way at the bottom, and they're very, very different. But if you actually order economic activity by county, you see that, in fact, the other half is a lot more similar to part of the orange half than the right side of the orange half is to the highest counties in the United States. So we have to be very careful in our use of color. Using maps is great, but using color can skew people's understanding of what our map is trying to show. Make sure you aren't just mapping population density and using it as a proxy for what you think you're presenting. All right? So that's the end of this design critique.